Welcome to Chilling Tales. We're taking a plunge into the world of scary horror stories. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more, and share your thoughts with us in the comments. So where are you tuning in from? Let's dive headfirst into these hair-raising tales so this story is true. There's a charming hidden lake just a short walk from my house in Parsonsfield, Maine. I've been fishing there for as long as I've lived here. Tucked away from any roads or houses, it offers perfect privacy, and I always have the entire lake to myself. I often leave my kayak in the same spot by the lake when I'm not using it. It's much easier than carrying it back and forth to the lake every time I want to fish. I usually lean it against a large tree by the water. The kayak is heavy enough to withstand strong winds, and I always cover it to keep critters from taking refuge inside. One warm summer evening, I was out on the lake for about an hour and had already caught a few trout, which I placed in the cooler. As dusk approached, the last bit of light was fading behind the trees. I was about to head back in when I heard sounds coming from the edge of the lake. I turned, and I saw someone standing at the water's edge, tipping a barrel and pouring its contents into the lake. It looked like they were polluting the water with something. I shouted, "Excuse me, what are you doing?" The person looked up at me, then ran into the woods, leaving the barrel's contents still spilling into the lake. I looked more closely at the liquid and noticed it appeared to be a dark red color. Though it was getting dark, so I couldn't be absolutely certain of its color. It was very dark, and a sense of unease crept over me. I decided it was time to leave. As a nature enthusiast, seeing someone pollute the environment made me sick, and I couldn't resist shouting at the person. However, I no longer felt comfortable staying. I planned to report this incident to the Department of Environmental Protection. I paddled the kayak back to my usual spot and took all my gear off before pulling it out of the water. While I was putting the cover over the kayak, I heard a single snap nearby, like the crunch of something under a person's shoe. I turned and was about to call out, "Who's there?" but decided against it. I finished covering the kayak faster than ever, leaving it on the ground instead of leaning it against the tree. Grabbing my gear and cooler, I quickly walked out of the woods and onto the road that led to my house. It was only a few minutes' walk, and I was back home. I kept looking over my shoulder the entire time, thinking someone might be behind me. I quickly put my gear in the shed and went inside, locking the door faster than I ever had before. I was genuinely spooked. After rinsing off the trout and putting them in the fridge for tomorrow, I decided to just heat up some leftovers for dinner. As the food was in the microwave, there was a knock at my front door. The fear and dread I felt during the walk back rushed back instantly, confirming my suspicion that I might have been followed home. Sure, here's a rewritten version of the story. My fear was basically confirmed. Who else would be knocking on my door this late? My lights were on, and my car was in the driveway. Whoever it was knew I was home. Fortunately, all the shades were closed, so no one could see inside. They knocked on the door again, just as the microwave beeped, signaling that my food was ready. I'm sure whoever was outside heard it since all the windows were cracked open. A moment later, there was a knock on the window, followed by a man's voice saying, "Excuse me, I think you saw me at the lake earlier. I'd just like to explain myself." There was absolutely no chance I was opening the door. The fact that they had stalked me to my house told me this was a dangerous person. They repeatedly knocked on the window and kept yelling, "Hello!" I decided to acknowledge him now that he was getting more aggressive. I yelled, "Yo, leave or I'll call the police!" I intended to call them either way, but it was still a threat to get him to leave. The man responded calmly, saying, "Sir, if you could just open the front door, I'll explain everything to you." I repeated my threat, and I didn't hear his voice again. At this point, I shut and locked every window in the house and turned on the AC. I also made a report to the non-emergency police number, detailing both the barrel being dumped into the lake and the man coming to my house. Additionally, I filed an online report with the Department of Environmental Protection. Making these two reports honestly made me feel a little better about going to sleep that night. Thank God I'm a light sleeper because, in the middle of the night, around 2 a.m., I heard a crash from downstairs. I immediately sprang out of bed and grabbed my Glock from the closet. I heard someone attempting to quietly ascend the creaky wooden steps. With my Glock loaded and in hand, I stood behind my dresser, aiming at the door. The slow, creeping footsteps grew closer to my bedroom door, which is the closest to the stairs and naturally the first one they'd approach. Sure enough, I heard the doorknob slowly press down, and then the door pushed open. I saw nothing but I saw his silhouette enter the room. I flicked on the lamp next to me so he could see my gun and screamed, "Get on the ground now!" He raised his hands in the air, seeming to motion for me to calm down. In his hand, he held a small blade. I ordered him to drop it, but calmly he said, "I'm leaving," and turned to run downstairs. I yelled at him to stop, but he clearly gambled on me being too afraid to pull the trigger. I heard him leave through the front door. I rushed downstairs to lock it and immediately called 911. My living room window lay shattered, glass scattered across the floor. I kept my gaze fixed on that broken window until the police officer arrived. I explained that I had already made a non-emergency report earlier about the incidents, concerned about the delayed response affecting any evidence of the barrel. In the darkness, 2 officers accompanied me to the spot where I had seen the man dumping the barrel into the lake. Despite searching for 20 minutes, it was nowhere to be found. The man must have ensured it was gone, leaving no trace behind. I provided the police with a detailed description of the man for their report. He was a short, bearded white man with a receding hairline, glasses, wearing a black flannel shirt and black pants. After the police left, I stayed in the living room all night with my gun by my side, watching TV. There was no way I was going to sleep with a broken window and some nut job potentially lurking outside. At dawn, my brothers came over to help me fix the window. My brother Dale stayed at the house while my other brother and I went to Home Depot to get the window, and Dale stayed at the house with me for a few nights until things calmed down. My theory, not entirely implausible, is that the barrel contained human remains possibly dissolved in some kind of acid. Why else would that man follow me home and then break into my house, potentially to harm me? Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. I knew that if I had opened my door to that man, something terrible might have happened to me. Ever since I was a little kid, all the older men in my family would take me fishing at every opportunity. It was like a cherished family ritual. With me being the youngest meant I was next in line to become an expert fisherman, just like all the older men in my family claimed to be. The ones who took it most seriously were my dad and his brother, Matthew. Our houses were outfitted like something you'd see on fishing shows. If you stepped into my house, you'd instantly know my parents spent more time on the water than on land. This is actually my dad's story, not mine. He's a pretty tough guy, not easily scared, but whenever he tells this tale, it's like he becomes a different person when he talks about it. My dad, John, doesn't usually like discussing it, but every now and then, at a family gathering or a special occasion, a relative will ask him to recount the tale, and he will. On this particular day, John was fishing with my uncle Matthew and their close friends Rich, Jeff, and Monty. They had set out early, long before the sun broke the horizon, heading to a remote spot they all agreed was prime fishing territory. This spot was a couple of hours boat ride from the nearest marina. Tucked away in a it was a cove that few bothered to explore, known among them for its abundant bass and occasional pike. The day began like any other fishing trip, the boat gliding smoothly through the mist rising off the water. Everyone shared stories and jokes over the hum of the engine as they anchored the boat in a familiar cove surrounded by dense forest. Monty, my dad's wild friend who tended to drink more than the others, cracked open a beer first, despite the early morning hour. My dad often tells me that Monty fished for hours, with the only sounds being the occasional splash of lure hitting the water and their own laughter. Oh, and the occasional crunch of empty beer cans they were drinking like water. As the day wore on, they had their fair share of catches, each one sparking a small celebration. As dusk approached, the light began to fade, and a dense fog rolled in from the water. My dad often describes it as the boat being swallowed by the fog. Rich, the most experienced fisherman in the group, kept mentioning that he had never seen fog like this. The fog was so thick it felt unnaturally dense. Jeff, the jester of the group, was nearly as drunk as Monty, both seemingly unfazed by the fog closing in around them. As darkness approached, they had hoped the fog would dissipate, but it stubbornly persisted. My dad and Rich decided Matthew should attempt to navigate the boat out of the cove and into open waters, where the fog might be less dense. Matthew, typically the cautious one, agreed. But despite Matthew's cautious approach, he narrowly avoided colliding with the shore, unwilling to risk damage to his prized boat. Reluctantly, they accepted that they would likely have to spend the night on the boat. My dad insisted they needed to inform their families about the situation, but they had drifted into a part of the cove with no signal. Knowing he couldn't neglect his work responsibilities, my dad volunteered to go ashore in search of a signal. Accompanied by Rich and Jeff, they agreed to join him. Matthew stayed back to watch over the boat and an increasingly inebriated Monty. My dad, Jeff, and Rich climbed out of the boat, getting slightly wet in the process. My dad grabbed the emergency flares from the boat, just in case they needed to signal Matthew to come find them if they got lost. The three of them ventured into the pitch-black woods, illuminated only by the glow of their phone flashlights. My dad and his friends were seasoned campers, so they weren't. The forest didn't scare them too much as they began trekking uphill, hoping that higher ground would improve their chances of finding a signal. My dad often recalled how dark and eerily foggy the forest felt. The fog seemed to envelop them as they moved. Just as they were adjusting to the dense atmosphere, a series of strange clicking noises pierced the silence. The clicks started in front of them before surrounding them completely. These sounds were unlike anything they had ever heard in the forest. The clicking was rhythmic yet erratic, as if someone were tapping out a code meant only for the woods themselves. The distinctiveness of the noise made one thing clear: it was human-made. The realization that they weren't alone hit them like a freight train. Rich, the most seasoned of the trio in outdoor survival, urgently whispered for them to turn off their flashlights. "Don't give away our position," he hissed with genuine concern. As the lights switched off, the darkness became thicker than the fog. The clicking noises stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so thick it seemed to press against their chests. Time lost meaning as they stood frozen, unsure of their next move. I'm certain they were all thinking the same thing. The fear that they might have stumbled upon some clandestine gathering or a woods cult was terrifying. Suddenly, the silence shattered with rustling noises, much closer this time. Then silence again. A guttural scream echoed through the trees, a sound so primal and filled with anguish, the guttural scream rooted them to the spot. And before they could process what was happening, rapid stomping noises thundered through the woods toward them. Acting on fear and pure instinct, the three men bolted back the way they had come. My dad fired the flare gun behind them. The flare sliced through the fog, briefly illuminating the woods. For a moment, the forest was as clear as day, revealing a horrifying sight. The red glow of the flare illuminated a pack of more than 10 individuals dressed in attire they were dressed in what could only be described as tribal attire, some wielding wooden spears. The flare's light lasted only a split second, revealing this chilling sight. Jeff screamed and nearly stumbled, but Rich quickly grabbed his arm, keeping him upright. My dad often describes this moment as the most overwhelming experience of pure terror he has ever faced. The forest seemed to conspire against them as they fled, ducking under branches and leaping over roots. By some miracle, they burst from the tree line, panting and disoriented, but alive. They shouted at Matthew to start the engine, urgency in their voices. Urgency left no room for questions. Matthew complied immediately and the boat lurched forward just as their pursuers reached the shoreline. In the chaos, my dad fired the last flare into the air, aiming it back toward the shore. For a brief moment, as the flare's light pierced the fog, they saw their pursuers standing motionless at the water's edge. It was eerie. There must have been at least 15 of them. The flare's light faded, plunging them back into darkness. Matthew managed to put a safe distance between them and stop the boat. After the engine went silent, the only sounds were the heavy breathing of Jeff, my dad, and Rich. My dad recalls that he couldn't process what had happened for nearly an hour, functioning solely on pure adrenaline and survival instincts. They took turns keeping watch while the others slept, and as soon as the morning fog dissipated, they departed. Interestingly, Monty had passed out before the ordeal began and doesn't remember any details from that night. Even now, recounting this story sends shivers down my spine. It's a reminder to imagine what my dad must feel when he thinks back to that night. Fishing has been a part of my life for as long as I can remember. Approaching 60 years old now, I've spent countless days on the water, and there's no other way I'd rather spend my time. With my kids grown and off living their own lives, things around the house are quiet these days. You could hear a pin drop most of the time. Sometimes I find myself missing the old days, like tossing a football around with my boys in the backyard, but some things just aren't in the cards anymore. I don't plan like I used to. Most of the time, I fish with my college buddies, but lately, I find myself going solo, like a lone wolf. This trip was one of those times. I haven't left upstate New York in over 15 years, and I don't see a reason to. We've got some of the best fishing lakes in the country right here, and I intend to make full use of them. It was mid-April, early in the season, just after the ice thawed and before May set in. For some reason, I felt drawn to a more secluded spot this time. I picked a nondescript lake in the middle. I chose a small, secluded lake in the middle of nowhere. I arrived an hour before sunrise, eager to be out on the water as the sun broke through. Unstrapping my kayak from the car roof, I paddled out to the middle of the lake and soaked in the early morning hues painting the sky. It felt like home to me, and I wouldn't trade a day like this for anything. Despite the chill in the air, my toughened skin seemed impervious. I could sense the sun about to crest the horizon. I geared up, aiming to catch a largemouth bass. I positioned myself along the outer edge of the weed beds, planning to head towards the lake's center if my luck turned. I opted for a 6.5-foot medium-action spinning rod, spooled with a 9-pound monofilament line. Using a wacky rig, a 4-inch rubber stickworm is my trusted choice for catching largemouth bass. Just as I was preparing for what I hoped would be a successful day on the water, something caught my eye across the lake. I couldn't make out the details from this distance, but I sensed something unusual happening. At first, I noticed movement by the lake. Mistaking it for another fisherman, curiosity drove me to retrieve my binoculars from my knapsack, typically used for bird watching. Peering across the water, I spotted 3 figures clad in dark attire with hoods obscuring their faces. They seemed engrossed in digging a hole near the lake's edge. I continued observing, anticipating they would place something inside. To my surprise, one of them began to pull something out instead. Pulled back from the binoculars, straining to see what they were extracting from the hole without success. The other 2 figures followed suit, retrieving several more items that remained indistinct to me. Utter confusion clouded my thoughts as they began hurling these objects into the lake, each one creating a sharp splash upon impact with the water. A sudden wave of fear engulfed me. I couldn't discern their intentions or identities, but a gut feeling warned they might pose a threat. Paralyzed by uncertainty, I struggled to decide on a course of action. Fortunately, they departed without noticing my presence. I considered ignoring what I had witnessed, but my conscience wouldn't allow it. Waiting until the figures vanished into the woods, I cautiously approached the spot where they had discarded their items. My hands trembled as I reached the location, now uncertain of what I might find. Instead of fishing for trout, I was searching for something entirely different. For an hour, I diligently probed the water, my efforts yielding nothing. Frustration mounting, I racked my brain for a solution. Then, it struck me. I had my depth checker. hidden in my Volvo. With determination, I hurried back to shore, fetched my depth checker from the car, and returned to the spot. Sweat streamed down my face as I probed the murky water, initially encountering only soft lake bed. Then, my fingers grazed something solid and metallic. Marking the spot mentally, I readied my fishing rod, swapping the rig for the largest hook in my tackle box. Slowly releasing the line from the spool, I felt its slight tension against my fingertip. Drawing on 50 years of fishing experience, intuition told to turn this into one significant catch. I sensed a subtle resistance in the line, a definite hit. With careful maneuvering, I tried to hook whatever lay beneath. After a tense minute, the line suddenly tugged harder than usual. I had snagged something. Slowly reeling it in, I took care not to lose my catch. What emerged from the water sent chills down my spine. There, dangling from my line, was a sleek black 9mm pistol. Those individuals had disposed of a firearm in the lake. My sense of safety evaporated instantly. I didn't bother scanning the surroundings for any other items. I carefully pulled the gun into my kayak, being cautious not to touch it, and hastily paddled away. Once on dry land, I immediately called the police. They launched a thorough investigation and uncovered several more disturbing items from the lake. Insisting on observing their search, I needed to understand what lay at the lake's bottom. Among their findings were a keychain with 7 keys and a bundle of old foreign coins wrapped in cloth. However, the most unsettling discovery was a locket. It was water damaged, causing the pictures inside to fade beyond recognition. The police assured me they'd reach out if they linked these findings to any criminal activity. However, I never received that call. But the story didn't conclude there. One night, some days after the incident, I overheard voices in my front yard. "That was the car, I know it," someone said. People began snooping around, circling my house without ringing the bell or knocking. Eventually, they departed. I was left wondering if they were the same individuals. And if they were, I can't shake the feeling of being watched whenever I leave my house. I notified the police once more, hoping to reopen the investigation, but it didn't lead anywhere. I'm still left with so many unanswered questions. Why were those items buried in the first place? And why would those people return just to unearth and re-hide them? Perhaps they realized the risk of discovery was higher underground, prompting them to dispose of the items in the lake. Or maybe those objects had been in that hole for years, and they chose to unearth them for some unknown reason. All in all, this was the most bizarre experience I've encountered while fishing in my lifetime. Throughout my life, I've gone through phases of various hobbies, immersing myself in each for about a year before moving on to something new. During the summer of 2022, my passion was fishing. About an hour's drive from my family's shore house, which we've owned for decades, lies a waterfront property with a lagoon and a small Boston whaler. My friends and I often took trips there to fish and relax. In October, after a summer filled with fishing, my 2 friends Kevin and Arian and I decided to spend a weekend at the shore house to try catching some stripers, as they are plentiful during the fall months. Kevin, an avid fisherman, was a major influence on my fishing enthusiasm. Unfortunately, our boat was out of the water for maintenance, so we had to fish from the beach and piers. This was no problem though, as Kevin had all the necessary rods and gear. We gathered on a Friday afternoon, and I drove us all down to the shore house. During the day, we fished from various piers along the inlet. As night fell, only Kevin had caught anything, a small bass, nothing too thrilling. Disappointed by our luck, we decided to stay up late and fish from the beach. Kevin mentioned knowing a great spot about 15 minutes away, which led us down a desolate road flanked by woods on both sides. The road eventually opened up into what seemed like a small gravel parking area. Kevin suggested that since we'd have to walk a bit to reach the fishing spot, we should take everything we needed now to avoid returning to the car. Planning to stay until sunrise, we packed accordingly. After a 5-minute walk down a path, we arrived at a sprawling beach. We set up camp with beach chairs, a speaker, and 2 coolers. One filled with ice for any fish we caught, and the other stocked with snacks and water. Beers. Kevin brought massive fishing rods perfect for beach fishing, along with rod holders to hammer into the sand. He also had small bells that attached to the rod tips to alert us to any movement. We cast our lines, cracked open a couple of beers, and settled in for the waiting game. Within 2 hours, each of us had caught decent-sized fish, which definitely lifted our spirits. We were having a great time, music blasting, knowing we were alone on this deserted beach. In the middle of our conversation, Arian suddenly stopped talking, lowered the music, and jerked his head to the left. He asked if we had heard that. "Heard what?" we replied. He seemed to concentrate for a moment before saying, "I heard someone yell something." We thought he was either hearing things or just joking, but he insisted he had heard a shout, something like, "Yo," or "Hey." It seemed unlikely, considering we were on a remote hidden beach at around 1 a.m. So he quickly dismissed it, and our conversation resumed, though it made us more alert. A few minutes later, just after I cast a fresh hook, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. There was a figure on the beach in the distance, but I couldn't make out what it was. The others noticed it too. As it got closer, we realized it was a person walking toward us. We grew silent and turned off the music. The figure approached, revealing a middle-aged white man, maybe 40 or 50, wearing a dark blue jacket with a hat and hood up. The way he walked up to us was really sketchy, and he had an intimidating look on his face. We awkwardly said, "What's up?" He just stared at us for about 10 seconds before saying in a low voice, "What are you boys up to?" It was pretty obvious what we were doing. Kevin replied, "We're fishing," to which he responded with a grunt of acknowledgement and a nod. He didn't say another word, just stood there, looking at us, then at the rods, and finally at the water. We exchanged uneasy glances, thinking he might try to rob us. There was no way he could have taken on the 3 of us, though. Suddenly, the bell on one of our rods rang, breaking the silence and signaling a potential catch. I called out, "We got one," aiming my comment at everyone, but especially at the strange man, hoping for a normal response from him. I walked over to the rods and reeled in a small striper. When I turned back to unhook the fish, the man had turned and left. We watched as his dark silhouette disappeared into the night. We quickly checked to make sure we had all our belongings, then sat and just talked about how odd that encounter had been. Since he left without harming us, we concluded he was just a weird man who was thankfully no longer our problem. To be cautious, we kept the music off and cracked a few more beers as our conversation shifted to different topics. At one point, while staring into the horizon, I thought I heard something in the distance. It took a moment to realize what it was, but when I did, my heart dropped. It was a car alarm, and I knew it was mine. It was the only car in that lot, and there were no houses around for miles. Panic set in, and we decided to run back to the car, leaving all our gear behind. It took us a few minutes to get there, and when we did, I was devastated. My tires had been slashed, and the driver's side window was shattered. I immediately called the police and reported our location and situation. The operator asked if I had any idea who might have done it, and we mentioned a sketchy guy who had approached us while we were fishing. She asked if I knew where he went, and I replied that I didn't know. Just as I said this, we heard rustling in the woods around us. My heart jumped into my throat. I felt trapped. We frantically ran about 200 yards down the road and hid among the trees. I relayed this to the operator, who instructed us to stay hidden and quiet. Within 10 minutes, we saw 2 police cars speeding with their lights on. We dashed back to the car and found 3 officers searching the area. Several items had been stolen, including my wallet, some cash from the glove box, and the rest of Kevin's fishing gear. They found a knife lying on the ground nearby, which they secured for fingerprints and evidence. Still pumped with adrenaline, I recounted the whole ordeal to them. They commended us for our quick thinking in running away and hiding, emphasizing that the man likely intended harm. Those words made me value my life even more. The officers ensure our safety, assisting us in packing up our belongings and transporting them back. They took our details and gave us a ride home. We stayed up all night, deeply reflecting on the unsettling events that had just unfolded. That morning, Orion arranged a ride north for us, and a few days later, I retrieved my car from the repair shop. To this day, it remains the most frightening experience I've ever had. What was meant to be a routine fishing trip turned into a harrowing ordeal, resulting in hundreds of dollars in damages. I never received any follow-up from the police, leaving me uneasy, knowing that the perpetrator may still be at large. Needless to say, I gave up fishing as a hobby and haven't touched it since.